W cyklu Co robią geografowie jest z nami dzisiaj Alexis Alamel, profesor geografii i planowania z Sciences Po w Rennes w francuskiej Normandii, który bada, jak mieszkają studenci w Europie, a jednocześnie jest współorganizatorem wielu wydarzeń popularyzujących geografię, w tym współorganizatorem finałów Międzynarodowej Olimpiady Geograficznej IGO, które odbyły się we Francji w 2022 roku. Hello Alexis, it's great to have you here.
Hi, Adam. Thank you for inviting me.
I mean, you are a researcher primarily, so I wanted to start with your research, actually, and what you are doing is actually asking how do students live in Europe. Is it somehow related, your interest in this topic is somehow related with your own experience because you studied abroad a lot?
I did study abroad a lot, but when I was 17, I left my parents' house to study. My parents live outside Paris, but still like an hour away from Paris. So my sister lived in Paris at that time. So we moved in together in a small studio apartment. It was like 25 square meters, and there was no privacy, just living in the same room. And then she moved out after a couple of years, and then I was lucky enough to study abroad. And so when I first collected the keys of my new student hall accommodation, I realized that there was just a different world out there. There was different ways for students to live into housing. And so that's kind of what garnished my interest on this question. Yeah.
And later on, you started to ask a question: how do students live in different countries? I mean, what are the differences? And do you observe huge differences between, European countries at least?
Yeah. So what I did is I wrote my PhD thesis in England about the local housing market of the town called Loughborough. And what was interesting is that students actually lived in a private accommodation, whether it was managed by big companies, corporate companies, or whether it was managed by personal landlords. And what I noticed is that there were different types of students because the students living in the big halls of residence, they were more, they had more financial support from their parents, and the students living in like the tiny houses and tiny homes in the town, in the city, they were they didn't have that many financial resources. So that was very interesting, especially when you keep in mind that at the time to be a student in the UK was very expensive, and still is, and even more expensive now, but it was a few £1,000s a year. So of course, as a parent, you want your kids to have good studying conditions. And when I look at compare the situation with France, it's very quite different. They don't have, and of course, as in the UK, there's not enough student accommodation, like in many European countries, they're not providing enough student accommodation. So students kind of don't have like a real patterns in where they live. They kind of find where the first place to live in, whether it could be like sharing an apartment with other classmates, whether it's sometimes staying at your parents' house because cost of living is a bit too expensive, and sometimes living in private halls. So what I observe is basically the situation in France starting to look like more and more like the situation in the UK, but 10, 15 years later. So that's very interesting in that case.
So France is just following the path of the UK with the, private accommodation.
I would say, unfortunately, yes. So private accommodation with kind of all inclusive. So you have like these massive packages, so you can pay your rent, you have internet included, you have electricity, water, gas, you can have Netflix, you can have access to like a local library, you can have like even fitness rooms inside the accommodation. So kind of becoming kind of luxury because students, young people are being marketed because bringing a university or bring more students into a city or in town, it's usually a sign of good dynamism, and economically that's kind of sound. So of course you want to attract students, and by attracting students, you want to provide them with the best living conditions.
Yeah, so it really seems like all inclusive, but it also means that the inequalities are increasing. Do we really observe that in terms of student accommodation, that the inequalities between students are increasing?
Yeah, because if you consider that students, after they're done studying for the day, they go back to their house. If you live a newer accommodation, you will have better energetic performance of the building that you won't have necessarily to worry about, especially if it's all inclusive, so you don't have to pay energy bills on top of your rent. And on the other side, if you have students who live in like old houses, maybe the temperature inside the bedroom is not like it's not necessarily satisfactory. It could be like 14, 15 degrees. And so you have, I mean, I've talked to a lot of students that during the winter time, they have to work with gloves and scarves and with a hat because it's so cold in their bedroom. So obviously then you don't have the same comfort to study. And that could be reflected in the grades, and that could be reflected as well in kind of how you feel engaged with your studies. So living conditions are very important because they could be kind of a break for students to pursue studies, but as well like impact their potential grades during exam season, for instance.
So it's that the economic inequalities that we observe in terms of where do students live transfer to the inequalities in their results and how they perform as students then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. If you have more, if you have financial support from your parents, or if you have more income, you can afford better living conditions, which will then help you for your studies.
So the student accommodation is closely related to the fact that students are moving from their hometowns to the place of their study. So what we observe now in Europe is like the mobility, the student mobility increasing. Do we have any statistics on that process? Is it like a dynamic process going on right now?
Well, I think a lot of things are kind of changing very quickly. If you consider Brexit, for instance, I did my PhD in England. I'm not sure it would be possible for me to go to England now without like they have restricted migration rules. The same for other countries as well. So international mobility has been kind of dramatically changed over the past few years. And students who were used to traditionally go internationally to the UK now will go to Germany, will go to the Netherlands, for instance, because they provide like English and international courses. So within countries, this can obviously change. And you have some countries, especially with the Erasmus programs, that welcome more and more students. I know French students are very keen to participate in Erasmus programs. In the case of my school at Sciences Po Rennes, when you're in your third year undergraduate, it's mandatory to study abroad, for instance. So it could be in Europe or could be anywhere else in the world. But you have this mandatory that you have to go abroad to study for that period of time.
And you need to find place where to live at that time.
And you absolutely, and especially when end up in countries where you don't necessarily know so much about, when you don't necessarily speak the language, it's always good when the university provides or can link you with some housing providers. But if you come late and if there's not enough housing accommodation, then you will have to go to the private sector, and then you will have to deal with a different kind of ecosystem of how do I get to talk to landlords to convince them that I want to live there.
So a lot of actually problems in that field are related to social processes, political processes. So is it really a topic for a geographer then?
Of course it is, because just the international mobility, when we talk about movement, when we talk about mobility, this is geography, because this is all about space, spatial perspectives. But then, as you said, when you arrive in a city, everything you do is geography. How do you go from your accommodation to your university? This is geography, because you are like acting in spatial environments. What do you consume? How you use your energy inside the buildings? How do you move inside your accommodation is also geography. It's like body geography, because there's always a movement. So this is why I think I really like geography, because it encapsulates so many different perspectives and dimensions, which is pretty rare for a social science field.
So actually, this leads to another question. I mean, how you are doing your research exactly? I mean, what kind of data you work with, and how this data contribute to the understanding of how the student lives, and how the student accommodation is organized in different countries.
So when I started to studying student accommodation, I was a student. And so obviously I
So you
felt it
had your
was
own experience.
and my own experience, I was able to exchange and discuss with my classmates about their living conditions, about their mobility on a daily basis. Then I became a PhD student, so the goal was also to stay connected to students. So I conducted a lot of interviews, but first I always usually start with a survey questionnaires, which I think for me is very interesting, especially when you have some agreement with the local university. Say, okay, I prepared a big online survey. It will be interesting for you to kind of share it with your students, so I can share the data with you, and we can work out on like who are your students, what are their living conditions, what are the pros, the cons, and what can be done to improve their living conditions and overall their well-being.
So universities are interested in the results of your research. I mean, you
Absolutely.
are answering the questions they pose as well.
Absolutely, and to me, that's kind of how I perceive researching. Is not only like for having publications, and it's not only providing new knowledge. It's as well like implementing this knowledge to make changes. And so when I talk to housing providers, I share with them like my results, and they're like, okay, we're gonna keep this in mind, and we're gonna consider that what we can do to improve in terms of the cost, in terms of the amenities, in terms of the space. And as well, when I do interviews with students, sometimes individual, sometimes focus groups. I like focus group because it's a good way as well for students to kind of have a free conversation among them and kind of discuss things and interact with one another. And so that allows me to really better understand what are students' living experiences. And I think this is something that some of the housing providers can see and notice on site, but it's always good to provide a real analysis behind it.
So not only universities, but also private sector. How about the local governments or the government, the central government, who is actually subsidizing student housing? Are they also interested in the data you have, like your findings?
Mhm. Well, the good thing is, like in France, we have some institutions that work nationally to collect big data. And so I don't work nationally. I like to work locally because I always think that you can see the change. The change is more rapidly locally than nationally, unfortunately. And so I kind of compare the data nationally, regionally, locally, and with kind of combining all these different analyses, some are mine, some are not. It really helped the local decision makers to have a better understanding of the situation on their land, for instance, in their territory. So this is very interesting. I'm try to organize as many meetings, and then people start to know me as a student housing guy locally. So sometimes they're gonna refer to me for some studies, and sometimes they're going to be like, okay, we're organizing a meeting with students. Do you want to be part of it to can help us out with better understanding? Because I mean, through my research, I understand kind of the local decision makers, and also understand the students and the students associations, for instance. So I'm kind of a buffer in between those different stakeholders.
But do local governments, responsible for spatial planning, do they have problems with student accommodation or students, somehow colonizing the neighborhoods? I heard about conflicts that appear just because the neighborhood is transforming very quickly because of the influx of the students. Have you investigated such cases?
Yeah, so when I lived and I did my research in England, it's a small town of 60,000 inhabitants and about 25,000 students. So obviously, this is what we call a university town or a university city. And obviously, you will see it in like kind of in the neighborhoods. Some neighbors were specifically targeted for students, targeted by the landlords. The landlords deciding it was more profitable to rent to 4 or 5 students paying 4 or 5 different rents than to rent to a whole family of 4 or 5 people. So gradually in the UK, what we saw is like the process of studentification, which means like the strong influx of students coming into a neighborhood, and then considerably changing it socioeconomically, but as well as physically. For instance, that the families who previously were owners had to move out, or renters had to move out, and then students living there, but students will stay there for a year or two. So obviously, the way you are like involved in the life of the neighborhood is clearly not the same. And so altogether, this this process of studentification is really strongly observed in the UK, but now it's also observed in France, where you have neighborhoods where the private landlords will only exclusively rent for students, because they can make more money with students renting than with families. So this creates a lot of issues as well of socio-economic inequalities.
So that's really interesting, actually counterintuitive that people renting their houses prefer students as tenants more than families. But do local authorities try to prevent that process of studentification? Then are they, trying to implement some measures of spatial planning or restrictions on renting?
Yeah. So this this gentrification process with students really started in the UK in the mid 2000s, and with the experience and seeing clearly that some towns were losing inhabitants because the families left, and the students are there for maybe 9 months of the year, and then they can go somewhere else. So they started to have implemented urban planning restrictions, that the landlords renting can only have a certain amount of houses to rent for the students, which type of things we can see with Airbnb rentals throughout Europe, for instance. So these limitations was actually very well welcome to kind of rebalance the student population with the local population, who have to live sometimes side by side with the students, and of course they don't have the same lifestyle, so which can be a bit conflicting on a daily basis. In France, we don't have this yet. I say we don't have this experience of like this strong influx of students. So right now the local communities really understand that the priority is to let the market be, which I would think in the future could create some problems.
Hmm. Well, we try to, imagine how student accommodation looks like. We sometimes think about like this Harry Potter-like dormitories, something that is really old. And actually, student accommodation is a really old, let's say, phenomenon, as old universities are. But are there any innovations in the field? Do you observe any innovations in terms of student housing recently?
Yeah, so when I really started to work on student accommodation, I was in the Netherlands, and I was just passing by right next to my student halls. There was a student halls made of shipping containers, and I was like, that's very interesting. So I actually wrote my master thesis on that. What was interesting is I went back 10 years later, and the residence completely disappeared. It
But it
was back.
doesn't sound very comfortable to live in a container.
I know, but that's what people think. And of course, you're not going to be in a container full of goods, or like with kind of nocive products, for instance. But it was very well designed inside. The indoor design was very interesting. And in terms of surface area, that was pretty satisfying for the students. So I did some research there to ask the students, were you satisfied with your living condition? What do you like? And they really did enjoy that. So what is also interesting is after 10 years, the halls of residence made of containers just moved out. And so now we have ships in the field using that space. And also, like, I'm doing some research on tiny houses in France, and I've noticed that some students live in tiny houses, so they are on wheels, and they can be moved as well pretty easily. And so it's about this reflection of maybe being a student is also living in 10, 14 square meters, that we can find in some student accommodation. So to me, students are kind of pioneers because they can experiment different types of living, and whether the students like it or not, maybe it could be implemented for the general population. So for me, students are kind of guinea pigs, and that's why I like to do some research on students, because they are very resilient in their living conditions and lifestyles.
And they tend to participate in that kind of experiment with smart housing or with small living spaces, as they do not spend a lot of time in their flats or apartments.
Yeah, because obviously, when you have a university not too far from your accommodation, then you're more likely to spend more time at the university, at the library, and go out and party because that's what students also do on top of doing some studies.
It sounds really interesting, and actually, I think it's also relevant for how universities and local authorities organize this. But just to let's say end this topic with a conclusion, do you see that student housing, student accommodation is like a growing problem, as many people say, or is it like just a regular natural transformation with these innovations, with the processes going on at the scale of the neighborhood? So is it like a growing social problem that students can't afford the proper living conditions in Europe, or at least in France, that you investigate more
I
closely?
would say in Europe overall, because the shortage of student housing is not only in France, but it's in the Netherlands, it's in Germany, and then you create a competition between young people who their desire is to studies and to get a degrees and then to get a job. But then first they have to compete on the housing market to be able to get an accommodation of decent quality and an accommodation that they can also afford. So this is to me a big issue, because we now the students entering universities, they went through COVID, they went through the lockdown, and what you tell them is like, okay, you're gonna start university, but first you will have to get accommodation. So you're gonna have to compete with thousands and thousands of other students in the same condition as you. So clearly there needs to be more accommodation built in towns and cities. But when we're thinking about building, we're thinking about like concrete. We're thinking about maybe destroying the land, destroying the biodiversity. So there are different ways, and that's why I think temporary and mobile housing that don't necessarily touch the ground, such as container housing or tiny housing, or even students on boats. For instance, in Copenhagen, they have like floating housing, student accommodation, which I think is a fantastic idea. So there's a lot of innovation that can be continued in that sense. But clearly, the students' housing shortage is a big issue.
hmm Great. I mean, your research is a great example of how geography can be relevant for let's say daily life, and then also for some political, social challenges we face. But you are also engaged in making geography more accessible, approachable, more visible for regular people. Let's say you are organizing GeoNights, and I promise that we will have just a brief conversation also about this. So just tell us more about the project. We know that there is like a museum nights, and this is kind of something that is happening regularly in Poland. But what about GeoNights? What's the aim of this project?
Okay, so GeoNight started in 2017, first by the French National Geographical Committee, who decided to, have one night a year where geographers could promote their work, can promote the field, geography field, through to the general public through organizing free and accessible events. So obviously those events preferably have to be free. They could be like a photo exhibition, could be like an urban walk, could be like a conference, could be in France, we also do a cheese tasting, which is also a little field, a subfield of geography, obviously.
And you need to
And
place the cheese the proper place on the map. Where does it come from?
yeah, yeah. That we do a lot of games around food, wine, cheese, and everything. And then gradually we realized that this was having a big success, and so over the past few years, they were like there's International Geographical Union plus UGO, which is an association with all the geography associations in Europe. We have worked on expanding internationally this event. So this year, this will take place on the Friday, the 4th of April. It's all around the world, free events. I know that colleagues in Poland are usually very keen in organizing these events. And as you mentioned, it's really about making geography visible, because people all around the world still imagine geography being about maps and being about, maps are important.
That was my question. I mean, do you think that these kind of events change the public image of geography? That it's not only, about remembering the capital cities of all countries all over the world, but also about, doing research that is socially, politically relevant. Do you think that these kind of events are changing this?
I think so, and that's really the goal, for people to understand that we are all geographers. We are all geographers. We are all moving in space. We are all, and even on their phones, people use like Google Maps, for instance. But this is purely geography. What path are you going to take? This one instead of this one. This is geography. Where do you get your groceries? This is geography. Where are you going out tonight? This is geography as well. So we try to make people understand that it's not the geography from middle school or primary school. This is really about how, as individuals, as societies, we evolve around the space around us, and how do we interact with the space around us? How do we interact with individuals? We're also doing geography right now, I guess. I mean, friends, you're in Poland, and we still manage to discuss. So we really try to provide the more tools and the more understanding to the people. And then the diversity of events organized in GeoNight is absolutely amazing, because depending on the towns, depending on the countries, you have different perspectives on what geography is. So I think this event is very important to really promote the geography discipline.
Great. I mean, probably the sentence that we are all geographers is probably the best conclusion of our conversation. But of course, we invite all our audience to participate actively in the Night of Geographers, not only this year but also in the following years. Alexis, thanks for this conversation. It was really interesting, and thanks for connecting and telling us about your research. All the best, and thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for everyone.